1. When I first moved to my current house, I was living there for about 7 to 8 months at this time. I came home from work and parked my car in my driveway to get the mail as I was waiting for something. I was still wearing my heels from work, and I have just stones in my driveway, so even walking with heels took me longer than usual, and I had to be careful not to fall. When I got to the mailbox and opened it, I saw a newer van in the corner of my eye, and it was a navy blue color. Like I said, it was newer and nothing to be alarmed about because it wasn't like it looked like a rape van or whatever. When the van reached just before my mailbox, I heard a screech and automatically knew they stopped right by me, and I also knew that I was the only one out on my street. It was completely dead. As soon as the car screeched to a stop, I heard the van door open. I left the mailbox open and I legit ran so fast in my heels all the way to my front door, and locked it as soon as I got inside. The car was already almost gone when I looked out the window. I was scared that this person knew where I lived, so I called the police and told them what happened. Could have been abducted. Something similar. I was at Wawa before work, and I was in a rush to get there as I was running late. There was an older man, about 40s I would say, before me in line. He had paid and turned around and saw me when I moved up to pay. Then I thought he was leaving, but when I went to leave, he was staring at me, almost waiting for me by the door. He held the door open for me, and I smiled and thanked him. I'm always super polite. He got in his car and started it. Then I got in mine, started it, and waited for it to warm about 5 to 10 minutes. I modded my car and prefer to keep my car healthy, so I have no problems. This whole time I noticed he kept looking at me off and on. When I started to drive off, he whipped out of his spot and followed, no joke. He was up my ass the whole 20 minutes it took to drive to work. I almost wanted to speed up on the highway and lose him, but there were cops around and I didn't want a ticket. I had an anxiety attack the whole way to work, and when I got there he drove off. I was texting my boyfriend, telling him what was happening the whole time, and he advised me to call the police. I was running late, so I didn't, but I really should have. People, no excuses for your safety. Who knows, he might show up later in my life. Last story, I promise. This one is a very serious one, and for the ladies that have been in any type of domestic violence relationship. You need to get out ASAP, no ifs, ands, or buts. There are hotter men out there with a true sincere heart that will restore your faith in love. I'm not going to describe all this man did to me because I'd have to go through 2 years of this relationship. Toward the end of the relationship he got back into drugs and was acting very crazy. He put his hands on me for too long, and this last time he did it. It flipped a switch in me and I was completely done and numb inside. So I made it clear that we were over. He hurt me so bad that I had to call the police. I also called them because after I told him we were done, he took my phone and got in his car and left. So we were trying to locate him. After the police found him, I filed a report and they kept him away from me and took back my phone so I could go home. I was numb but also crying all the way home. Pretty much just looking back at the whole nightmare of the 2 years I stayed with him. When I got home, I called my best friend and poured out my heart to him and hysterically cried. Not too long after I got home, I heard a large knock on my bedroom window while I was on the phone, which scared the crap out of me. I looked closer and realized that it was my ex in the window, crying for me to take him back and talk to him about it. I refused 1,000,000 times and he stayed outside my house in the blistering cold for about 2 hours before I warned him I am calling the police. The police came and I filed another report. They dealt with him and he had left. The morning after, my ex had broken into my home, ripped the covers off of me, grabbed my phone and started to abuse me more. He dragged me quite literally outside to his car, where he continued to scream at me about God knows what. In between him yelling at me, I was trying to calm him down. He was taking large swigs out of a Jack Daniels bottle. He punched his window and tried to put my face in the glass that fell. There's more to this story, but this is already a long post. So in closing, All of you guys need to be careful and trust your gut, no excuses. I hope to never meet any of you again. 2. This happened a few years ago on a night out in central London. I was living in Zone 1 at the time, so everywhere I went was reasonably safe, and within walking distance. I was about 20-ish, and on the raz with my friend called Jess, who was notorious for getting thrown out of clubs for being a drunken mess. Of course, tonight was no exception to her usual behavior, even with my ill-fated attempts to get her to drink some soft drinks in between her beloved tequila shots. We had a pretty good time while it lasted. Up until when I found Jess being an obnoxious git toward the porter in the toilets. I won't go into the specifics of that incident. She was probably someone's let's not meet that night. But I had to haul her ass out of the bathroom before she got herself kicked out. Alas, it was too late. And a bouncer grabbed Jess and told her it was probably time for her to go home. Reluctantly, I concurred, as this was an all too familiar scenario. I wasn't a huge fan of taxis, so I was trying to get Jess to eat food and drink water outside the club, so we might have a chance of walking, if only the night tube had existed back then. No such luck. The bouncer who'd kicked Jess out came over and said she'd call us a taxi from a reputable company, so we could get home safely, and she'd also bring Jess fresh water until it showed up, as opposed to my tepid Volvic water. I thanked her for her help and accepted, as I didn't really know any reputable taxi companies by heart. The taxi showed up and the driver was a middle-aged guy anywhere from 45 to 55, balding, short, kind of chubby, and Asian. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, as he was your bog-standard London taxi driver, and he initially came across as a nice man. As a side note, I remember that he actually had a picture of what appeared to be his kids in the car, and a wedding ring on. The taxi driver dropped us off at the flat, and I stopped outside my flat door to have a cigarette. Before going inside, Jess is still with me. The taxi is still parked on the pavement, even once I've finished smoking. Again, nothing out of the ordinary, probably waiting for a pickup call. Though in hindsight, weird for a busy Friday night in Central. Of course, as fate would have it, I can't open my stupid old apartment building door because it's jammed. The door gets stuck all the time, and once it took me 20 minutes to actually get it open. To get to the point, after trying to open it, the taxi driver gets out of the car to help. He'd obviously been watching the struggle. Still no luck, so I told him it's okay and we'll go to a friend's house nearby. Everyone was asleep, so I was bullshitting because the presence of this guy was starting to make me feel uncomfortable. He insists he drives us there. Idiot Jess has a new lease of life, and jumps in his car and basically drags me in it with her. This is a girl who has accepted lifts from strangers whilst alone and drunk before. I'm honestly surprised she hasn't been kidnapped or seriously hurt yet. For about 5 minutes, which seemed like forever, we are sat in his car not moving, with the driver asking us some really weird personal questions. Do we have boyfriends? Is anyone else in our flat? Did we go out with anyone else that night? Alarm bells were ringing in my head, and I'm sobering up fast, because some of these questions are very strange for a middle-aged man to be asking two 20-year-old girls. As he starts the car to apparently drive us to King's Cross, literally no useful trains would be running and they'd all go out of London, I jump out of the car, dragging my friend with me, with the excuse that I need a cigarette and I need to call someone. I asked him to leave politely and carry on with his night. He drives off round the corner after this, and I think that I finally lost him. I felt kind of bad because I had labeled him as a creeper at this point. Once he'd gone, I go for the door again, and I still can't open the damn thing. By this point, I think it was anxiety kicking in that was making me ridiculously inept with my door. Jess tried to open it as well, but her hand-eye coordination was not being forgiving in her state. Of course, he came driving back round to check. Up until this point, you could perhaps see this as an older man's concern for two vulnerable young women. Taximan gets out of his car, basically snatches the keys out of my hands, attempts to open the door and fails. One last exasperated attempt. I grab the keys back and actually manage to open the damn thing. and he stood right behind me. Idiot Jess basically torpedoes herself into the building, gives the taxi man a hug as thanks, unaware of any weird tension going on. As I give a reluctant verbal thanks, I don't hug my friends or close family much, let alone taxi drivers. To the taxi driver, he grabbed me, and my suspicions were confirmed. This man, old enough to be my dad, put my arms down to my side, and put his face on mine in an attempt to kiss me, and kind of push me into my building at the same time. I can still feel his bristly face to this day, along with his disgustingly overpowering aftershave. His tongue was desperately trying to pry open my mouth, made me sick to the core. Obviously I did not reciprocate. I leant backwards to try and escape. And what was his oblivious response to this clear rejection? He proceeded to lick my face. Licked my fucking face. I'm surprised I didn't vomit there and then. Instead, I headbutted him and kicked him in the balls. Luckily, he let me go out of shock, and I had enough time to slam the big old crappy apartment door in his face. I ran up to my flat with Jess in tow, who was none the wiser about what had happened, and later dismissed the incident as nothing. I locked the front door, barricading even my bedroom door behind me. I watched out the window and his car lurked there for another 15 minutes, driving round the street a few times, probably hoping I'd come out and smoke again. I couldn't sleep for most of the night. I was extremely upset and angry. As I've thought about the incident again and again, I realize I should have called the police, or even the bar or club whose bouncer called the taxi regarding this man. I have always assumed that whilst I was in the taxi, he didn't have the intention to harass me, but the opportunity arose at a later time, and he chose to take it. Who knows what his full intentions were, but I'm sure glad I didn't find out. So, creepy taxi driver, let's not meet again because I swear to God, you'll be getting an even harder kick in the gullies if we do. 3. This was quite easily the closest I've ever come to cardiac arrest, and considering some of the professions I've had, that's saying a bit. In mid-2004, I'd become newly separated from my wife, and decided a getaway and career change were in order. Call it a geographical cure if you will, but that's a story for another time. I decided to move a couple thousand miles away from my home to attend a quick 4-month continuing education course in industrial radiography and ultrasonics in Calgary, Alberta. I'd fared well in the course, and due to the oil boom happening in North America at the time, I was literally hired by a large company, waiting outside the doors as we graduated from our educational endeavors. Taking the job entailed moving a further 800 miles into the north of Canada to be based out of a small town which serviced surrounding oil fields. I had no idea what the place would be like, and what I'd be in store for. At the time, the north of the Canadian prairies had taken all the influx of workers that it could, and infrastructure didn't really grow with the boom. Trying to find a place to live up there was next to impossible. I'm not at all stretching the truth when I say that people were renting their balconies for people to pitch their tents on in a couple of places. I kid you not. Some of the places that ended up being rented out weren't really even fit for human habitation. This was the Black Gold Rush. I overstayed my company chit in a hotel that they put me up in for a month, and was told I had to find a place to live. It was absolutely next to impossible to find accommodations for a few reasons. I was working between 12 to 20 hour days, and the vacancy rate was less than 0%. I decided to look at some outlying communities. I asked for a day off and ended up driving about an hour from our office and found a small farming community. I used the word community loosely. This was a spattering of easily 60 to 100-year-old dilapidated houses, centered around a greasy main street. Liquor store doubled as a post office, bar doubled as a hotel, and the grocery store looked and smelled of a slaughterhouse that could have been condemned. Wild West shit. I drove by an old house that had obviously been divided into several apartments, and almost couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the orange and black "For Rent" sign screaming out at me. My heart did sink a bit. The place was clapboard and the kind of dirty you can see before you even get out of your truck. At this point, after about a month of brutality on the pipelines of Alberta, I was exhausted and simply didn't care. It was irony abound. I was making wicked money and could have afforded an uptown place. But because of the boom, I was going to be forced to live in a fucking ditch. Great. Again, I digress. I ended up taking an apartment in this building. That's an abuse of the word apartment. This was a dive beyond dives. They say that Alberta is rat-free, but I can testify that this statement is a crock of shit. And I don't mean just a variety of rodentia. The people living in this building could easily have qualified as something that had crawled from the oil and grease-laden hulls of a ship, straight up the steps and into a pile of meth on a cheap fucking kitchen table. The place itself was enough, that I could easily have said let's not meet. Carpets that were once grey were now an indescribable clay colour, dirt rubbed into dirt, into on-sale off-tint paint, carelessly rubbed all over the place with a $1 brush. And the smell. Think of unwashed hair, wrapped around rotten vegetables that have been thrown into a wet paper bag, and you're getting somewhere close. After sighing loudly and handing $2 fucking grand over to the landlord in cash, I took the place. Didn't have a choice. Besides being exhausted, I knew I'd not get another day off, and I was right. I worked from July to December 24th without a day off, barring the day I procured my glorious abode. I had arranged beforehand to get a bed from Sears that morning, and had it in the back of my truck. I dragged the queen mattress across that barroom of a kitchen floor into a place that had been divided off by a 16th-inch wood panel into a bedroom. For the next 9 months, this would be my home. If the grubby kitchen table and one chair that were sitting in the place wouldn't have been included, the only thing in the place would have been that bed. That would be it, except for my alarm clock on the floor. Get up at 4 a.m., drive, work like coal miner until sunset, drive, drink whiskey, drop on bed in coveralls, rinse. Repeat for hundreds of days, literally. Then one Friday evening in October, I'd come home after a particularly brutal day of dragging my ass through the mud. My feet finally hit my kitchen floor at around 11 at night, and I was in a mood. I sat down at that piss-ant kitchen table in my fire-retardant coveralls, covered in mud past my waist. I don't know if you've ever worked these kinds of hours in these kinds of conditions, but after a while you stop caring about just anything. I sat there, and downed about a half pint of whiskey and a quarter pint of thyme, and smoked cigarette after cigarette. Lit each one of the bastards with the last one I'd smoked. I knew I was in trouble with the drinking and smoking, but as with most things, I didn't give a shit. I'd become married again, married to work, married to the mud, married to the oil, married to the welding, the pipe, and married to the hours that turned me as dirty as the place I inhabited. After I'd finished hating on my body for an hour, I noticed it was past midnight, and I knew I'd have to be up in 6 hours. That was considered our day off up there, not starting work until 8 a.m. on the weekends. I crashed down on my bed, coveralls still wrapped around my waist, commando underneath, the rust scraper I carried to remove scale from welds before I x-rayed them, still in my side pocket. Reached over and clicked on the alarm button with a sigh. I remember thinking that I was pretty sure that none of this was worth the money. I was a shell of a human being. In those days I'd often drift in and out of consciousness while trying to sleep. I'd be buzzed, overtired, and really just resting until the next onslaught of hundreds of welds. I remember that night hearing a fair amount of scratching in the kitchen just past the partition that made the door to my room. At one point, I think I took exception to it and grumbled a bit at it. The mice, rats, and roaches were louder than usual. Who knew what the fuck the crackheads were doing next door tonight? Then I remember drifting off into a numbed, half-dreaming state. The scratching had stopped. I hadn't been laid in months and started into a semi-dream about a woman I'd seen earlier at a gas station in one of the nameless towns we'd passed through as a crew. Then I saw her shadowy form at the foot of my bed, and I smiled. Then, as my eyes slowly registered, half open, I realized that I was no longer dreaming, and that it wasn't her. And that he was breathing loud. He was standing at the foot of my bed, and as I froze in terror for what seemed to be 15 seconds, he grabbed my foot. "Lisa!" He breathed out at me in a slurred, throated pitch that brought with it the smell of a chemical that managed to overshadow both the whiskey on my breath and the hovel smell that was the atmosphere I lived in. Now, I'm not a huge guy, but when I get all kinds of freaked out, I'm fairly strong. I remember not even thinking, just reacting. I pulled this scraper from my side pocket and launched myself, rolling sideways off the bed, wrenching my foot from his grip. I don't think I'd even hit the ground before I was on my feet, and I swung hard. I not only felt skull when that scraper connected with the front of his head, but I heard it scrape across that shadow. The next blur would have been comedic relief had the situation not been what it was. He howled in pain, and almost in a hurt feelings kind of way. Because I was still half drunk, and had launched myself at him like a linebacker practicing on the full height tackle. My head went straight into the goddamn wall near the edge of my door, and sent me back straight onto the bed. I hit fucking hard whilst hyperventilating, intelligently yelling, "Gah!" I remember the sound of my scraper hitting the kitchen floor with a shitty sounding clang, and I remember the bright flash as I fell backwards, and right before I lost consciousness, I remember thinking, "Oh fuck, he's got me." I passed out. When I came to, I don't really know how much time had passed. I came back slowly, but as soon as I remembered what was going on, I made an attempt to leap back to my feet. And dizzy as a dog that's been beaten, I fell sideways onto my left arm and felt it crunch under my weight. I remember screaming, "Fuck, fuck, fuck, motherfucker!" as loud as I could before I got back up and charged into the kitchen. I slammed the heel of my hand into the wall where the light switch was, flooding the greasy yellow light over the mess that was my kitchen. The front door was wide open. I was standing in blood, and no one was there. I remember hearing scurrying behind the door across the hall from me, like someone was trying to figure out what was going on in the cacophony that was my shithole apartment. I had a few lengths of pipe in the kitchen. They were 2 to 4 inch pieces of pipe cutouts, but welded together as test welds. I'd brought them home as examples of weld defects to study. I grabbed a 2-inch diameter sample of pipe that was about 3 feet long, and ran at my front door. No one there. I don't really know how long I was out for in the bedroom, but as the realization that the intruder had fled crept onto me, so too did the adrenaline leave me. I began shaking, dropped the pipe, and sat down on the floor right in my doorway. The chick who was living across the hall opened her door and asked me if I was okay. I sat there bare-chested with muddy coveralls up to my waist, curly hair turned into Jimi Hendrix on a bad night, with blood from my forehead running across my face. I'm sure I absolutely stunk, and stunk of the whiskey that had fucked me into my doorway. It was probably a classic YouTube moment, as I Jack Nicholsoned up at her with my pointy eyebrows, and sarcastically drawled out at her, "Does it look like I'm the fuck okay?" She just slowly closed her door and probably figured I was another oil-field crackhead who'd gone off the rails for another holiday. What I saw then really bothered me, almost more than the intrusion. The entire outer door frame had been removed from the outside of my entrance door. That guy had worked hard to get in there. He wanted in. He wanted in quietly. And whoever Lisa was, I'm certain that he hadn't intended her much good. Oddly, I remember feeling more nauseous about whoever that was raping and doing God knows what to a stranger named Lisa than I felt about the actual intrusion. I stood up, closed the door, and picked up the overturned kitchen chair, plunking down into it. Then I almost puked across the kitchen table, and whatever drunk there was left in me suddenly dissipated. For one of the few times in my life I was genuinely frightened, and I do not frighten easily. I remember waiting a while before I called the cops. At the time, the RCMP were often few in number, and overworked in those remote areas. They never even showed up until hours later, explaining that since I told them that he was no longer there, they felt I was safe. Later, when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, face bloodied, left arm screaming in pain, someone else's blood on my hand. I remember wiping my hand across the mirror to try to get some of the grunge off the glass. I sat there and stared at the blood I left on the mirror for a good 10 minutes, and decided that my time in that town was over. Called my boss when the sun came up, and told him he'd either be putting me back up in the hotel, or I was driving the fuck south, and he could hire whatever deranged, goddamn crackhead he wanted. He agreed after I explained the night. And so came the end of my tenure in Hines Creek. So you meth-head son of a bitch, let's not meet. Not in the dark in the middle of the night, while I'm sleeping anyway. But by all means, come on by while I'm awake, motherfucker. Lock your doors at night. Call police when you think you should, especially if you're a woman. Take this kind of shit seriously. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 262. Thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. You know, every now and again you do a story in these videos, and you're going through it, you're thinking, have I done this before? Have I done this before? And I had that reaction with the taxi one, with the creepy London, or the creepy English taxi driver guy. And, no, I definitely couldn't have, because it was only published about a month ago. And I even checked through my subscriber stories just in case, although I think the person would have remembered that they sent it to me. But no, I'm guessing I've probably just done a similar kind of creepy cab driver story before, because I've definitely done cab driver stories. So yeah, that's probably what happened there. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.